So now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Bob Sprague, charter member and president of the Native Orchid Conference. He's a longtime director and past president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Orchid Society, known as SEPOS, one of the biggest orchid society in this region. And he's going to talk about a topic, orchids of the New Jersey pine barrens. Normally, most of our podcasts are about, native plants that you can plant in your backyard and how to plant for pollinators and monarchs and things like that. But this talk goes more to our mission, to appreciate the more rare and unique flora of New Jersey. And these are certainly unique flora. So Bob, if you want to unmute and share your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Looks good.
Well, good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us and inviting us. A couple things before we start. Anybody who looks at this title page and sees the bottom there, it says, "And why NAOC is interested." It used to say the Smithsonian. And coincidentally, just today, I got a call from the Smithsonian asking me to publicize the North American Orchid Conservation Center. As you probably know, the Smithsonian is a monstrous organization, and they have a number of conservation-oriented parts or components. The Tropical Conservation Group, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is in Maryland on the eastern shore, on the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a very high-tech scientific research facility. And an offshoot or a subset of that is the North American Orchid Conservation Center. So that's why that is changed. The other thing I want to mention is, coincidentally, last night I did a similar talk for Penn State for the Master Gardener program, and I assumed that those folks knew a lot. And they do, certainly, but they didn't know quite as much about orchids as I thought. So I eliminated something and got a lot of questions at the end. So tonight, I'm going to include the very basic, what is an orchid? Why is an orchid and not anything else? So those of you who are experienced and know this will quickly fill and just bear with me here. So there are three main things that distinguish the orchid family: morphology, which is the structure of the plant, the pollen and pollination, and seeds. First off, orchids are monocots, so that's probably, I guess, 25% of all flowering plants. I'm not really sure of that, but I checked that out today, in fact, and that's what I got. The structure of orchids is critical. So we talk about symmetry, and many flowers have what's called radial symmetry, which means you can cut that flower in half anywhere around the circumference of that circle, looking down at the top of the flower, and you get two equal halves. Orchids don't do that. Orchids have what's called bilateral symmetry. There's only one line that you can draw through an orchid flower and get two equal halves, and they're opposite or mirror images. So that's a key identifying factor of orchids. We get a lot of folks come out and ask us about polygala. It looks like an orchid. The way it sure does, but you can tell that it's not. It doesn't have this symmetrical structure. So orchids also have three sepals, and those, you know what sepals are, the part that encases a bud when it's just starting to form. And when the flower opens, usually the sepals sort of dry up, back off. They're inconspicuous. But in the case of orchids, they're an integral part of the flower. And so here we have the three sepals with the red dots. And then we also have three petals, two of which are lateral petals with the yellow dots, and those look very much like the sepals. And the third petal is called the lip. It's highly specialized, and that's where the reproductive parts are. So that's the structure of an orchid flower. Then we talk about pollen and pollination. An orchid pollen is unique. Its structure is like that of only one other thing. What it is? Maybe milkweed, of all things. And then we have some Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed, and it's got what we call aggregated pollen. Compare this, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Here's a nice Turk's cap lily, and this you did in the 6th grade class. You studied the parts of a flower. You've got the pistil with the anther, and the ovary is down in here. Then we've got 6 beautiful stamens with anthers, and these fuzzy things on the anthers are pollen grains. And you know what happens when you take an Easter lily and shake it or blow on it, the pollen goes all over the place. The same thing happens if you park under a pine tree when it's in bloom. You get these pollen grains all over it. If you try to wipe them off, you get a yellow smeared mess. Well, that doesn't happen with orchids. The pollen doesn't blow around in the wind. It's aggregated. And that means it's clumped together in a little glob. And here we see on the left-hand side, right in the middle, a glob of pollen, aggregated pollen, hundreds, maybe thousands stuck to that thing. And it's attached to the flower with a little thread called a stipule. And if you look at the other flowers, you see this sort of ivory colored thing, 2 of them on each flower, and down to the bottom here again. Those are pollinia waiting for something to happen. This one in the circle happens to have been dislodged, and just coincidentally, we can see it. And on the right side, a different orchid flower, we have 2 sets of pollinia. They come in pairs, usually 2 or 4 pollinia per flower. And so that's a marked difference and very diagnostic of the orchid family. And pollination, of course, is very different because of that feature. The pollen doesn't blow in the wind. It's stuck to the flower, so it's got to be mechanically removed and taken to another flower. Well, how does that happen? Well, mostly insects. Here's a hummingbird clearwing, a sphinx moth, and you see all this yellow stuff stuck to his eyes? That's a whole bunch of orchid pollinia. He was out looking at orchids to get nectar, and got these things stuck to his eyes. On the right-hand side, we have a hummingbird with a little orchid pollinia stuck to his bill. When I took that picture, I didn't know that was there. It wasn't until I got home and realized I had captured the pollinia on a hummingbird. So they pollinate orchids. So do bats. In the middle, we have a small insect. I thought it was a mosquito. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but he's got pollinia that he's working on. So that is key to orchids. And it's such a fascinating topic and so unique and so amazing. It really captivated Darwin. He wrote a book just about the whole subject, the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects. And 3 of the major methods that occur, there are others, but these are the 3 main ones: mimicry, deception, and reward. And we'll look at each of those very quickly here. Mimicry. So here is a bee orchid, the so-called bee orchid. It's the genus Ophrys. It's not native, it's European. Ophrys grow around the perimeter of the Mediterranean Sea and then up into northern sections of Europe. This is Ophrys speculum, named after this blue, shiny, mirror-like surface on the lip. But look at the other photo. This is the same, not the same flower, but the same species of flower. You can see the lateral petal here. It looks just like the wing of this bee. And look at the fuzz on the bee. It kind of matches the fuzz on the lip of the flower. And here's a thing on the thorax of the bee that kind of looks like a speculum. So we'll talk later about what this bee is doing. But he was attracted because he thought this was one of his kinfolk. And then we have deception as a strategy. And if you look at this quickly and you're not sure about what it is, it's a native orchid, but you look at these fuzzy things with the yellow tip on top of this lip here, And it looks for all the world like anthers, like maybe we've got pollen here. Well, lo and behold, bumblebees are attracted to that, and they think they're going to get some pollen. And what happens is they land on here, and it's bogus. There's nothing there. They're just little protuberances with nothing to reward the bee. And this flower, this lip, is a little bit weak right here where my arrow is. And so when the bee lands there, that whole thing just collapses. And down here, this dark spot is where the pollinia are. And so the bee goes down and gets whacked against that and gets pollinia stuck to his back. And that's what a flower looks like after that has happened. This is where it bent down, and the bee would have been in between these two surfaces here. The third methodology is reward. And to me, this is the most fair. I mean, you're going to pollinate a flower, you ought to get something for it, and vice versa. So this is a pipevine swallow-tailed butterfly on a native orchid at the gold crested orchid. And he lands on the flower and puts his proboscis down into the nectary, which is a spur behind the flower, and sips out the nectar. And in the process, he reaches down and bangs his eyes into the pollinia, and off he goes with orchid pollen stuck to his eyes. At least he got a reward for it. So that's the business about orchid pollination in a real quick nutshell. It's unique. So the other thing about orchids is their seeds. They contain no endosperm. So the seedlings have to rely on something else to get sustenance to get them to start growing. So here we have a whole bunch of seeds you recognize, a whole bunch of beans, peas, rice. I think they're pumpkin seeds down on the bottom, and on top a bunch of grain, milo, poppy seeds, barley, corn, wheat, some white millet. These are the things that we eat, that animals eat. It's the carbohydrate or the starch that seeds contain, and they didn't make it for us. They made it for the plant. And you've all done this experiment in grade school. The teacher gave you a little peat pot and a lima bean seed, and you put the seed on the pot and you watered it and you put it in the windowsill. And every morning when you came into class, you looked to see how your seed was doing. And eventually the seed split open and a root shot down into the peat pot and a leaf emerged and started the growth of a lima bean vine. So we don't have that with orchids because orchid seeds don't have anything to eat. This is a pod from one of my orchids, which I cut in half, and you can see it's not that big. It's about the size of 2 pennies maybe. And every one of these little specks, dust-like specks, is an orchid seed. There are thousands, there are tens of thousands of them in this little pod. And they have germplasm. Those are the cells that give rise to new life, but they don't have anything for that new life to feed on and grow. So they have to rely on the very complex and not totally understood relationship with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And that's an ongoing study. Scientists around the world are working on that, and it comes into play a little later on. We'll talk about what's going to happen eventually as we learn more about this phenomenon. So let's get to the pine barrens. Where are they? Well, you probably know more about this than I do, you folks that live in Jersey, but roughly from Trenton east to the ocean, everything south of that was pine barrens. How did the name get to be? How did it originate? Well, early settlers came over from Europe. They brought all their stuff with them, their animals, their crops, their tools, whatever, and they tried to duplicate life back in Europe. Well, they planted things that simply didn't grow here. And that was quite discouraging. And it got to be known that, got to be assumed anyway, that the area was barren. It wasn't conducive to growing things. So it got to be called the Pine Barrens. And now we talk about pine lands. So are the two terms, pine lands and pine barrens, synonymous? Basically, yes. The older folks like me call it pine barrens. But there was an effort back in the early 60s or mid 60s to build an airport in this area. And it was going to be 50 square miles. It was going to be one heck of a mess. And fortunately, that project got squelched and that didn't happen. It was supposed to kind of replace the Philadelphia airport, which sorely needs replacing, but not in the Pine Barrens, please. So folks got together, some enlightened folks, and said, we've got to prevent this kind of stuff from happening. So in 1978, the Pinelands National Reserve was created with 1 million acres of land, about 22% of the state of New Jersey. And that's the area inside this green line. That's the boundary of the National Reserve. So it's not the whole Pine Barrens, but it's a good chunk of it. And it's interesting to note that back in the early 1800s, there was another scheme to develop the pine lands. A guy by the name of Joseph Wharton knew about the water that's under here. And you should recognize, or maybe you know, maybe you don't, the water in the pine lands is extraordinary. And it's all basically underground water, if that's a proper term. There are no mountain streams flowing down and bringing snowmelt down into here, or rivers coming. It's all water underground that comes up under certain conditions and flows out of the Pine Barrens in a series of 9 rivers. The Batstow, there's a bunch of them. Oswego, places you go canoeing sometimes. So the water in the pine lands is estimated to cover, it could cover all of New Jersey to a depth of 10 feet, which is really remarkable. It's nearly half the amount of water consumed in the US in a year. And some people have said that the water that flows out of the Pine Barrens in one day would suffice to cover New York City's drinking water. So this fellow Wharton was going to take advantage of that. He bought up a lot of land, and he was going to pump the water out and sell it to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. Well, fortunately, that idea got squelched. That would have been an absolute disaster. I guess it's safe to say that Mr. Wharton didn't get too ticked off, because he donated a lot of land, and now a bunch of that is the Wharton State Forest. And he also happens to be the same benefactor that the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Business is named after. So what's so special about the Pinelands? Well, it's kind of unique. There's not a lot of Pine Barrens habitat anywhere. There's a little bit in the Northeast, but basically this is the crown jewel. So let's talk real quickly about the things that make the Pine Barrens what they are, starting with geology, which is the Earth's physical structure and substance. It's what you stand on when you walk around outside. How did it get there? What ancient natural forces change it over time? Things like tectonic shift, volcanoes, earthquakes, glaciers, all those things that played upon the land and formed it into what it is today. In the case of the Pine Barrens, the primary geological influence was glaciers and the corresponding sea level change. At times, lower sea levels placed the coastline approximately 1 mile east of its present location. We were left with a low, barely 100 feet above sea level, flat plain that exceeds 2,000 square miles and is comprised of sand, specifically quartz. And here we are. This looks like a pile of rocks, but that's highly magnified. It's like beach sand. That's basically what's throughout the Pinelands. So it's drains very quickly, but it doesn't have any, or it doesn't have much organic matter. So that really highlights or controls some of what happens in the area as far as vegetation is concerned. Hydrology. That considers the properties of the Earth's water and the movement of that water in relation to the land. So the blue overlay that you saw on the previous map, actually it was an outline of a major aquifer called the Kirkwood-Cohansey system. The water is really close to the surface, in some cases barely 2 feet. So it's quite accessible, but that makes it easily contaminated by human activity. So we have to be really careful. Okay, habitat. That's the natural environment of a place. It's determined in part by the geology and hydrology, but also altitude, which influences temperature, latitude, which determines the duration of sunlight, and other physical features such as topography, and in the case of the Jersey Pinelands, proximity to the ocean. And why is that an issue? Because it mitigates temperature extremes. So we have fairly consistent temperatures. And then we consider vegetation. The geology and hydrology and habitat issues that create what might be compared, I like to compare to the physical structure of a house, and they determine what can grow in a place. The vegetation, then, I kind of liken to the interior decorating, curtains and drapes and carpeting and so on. The Pine Barrens have several microhabitats, which make it unique. There are a few other examples of Pine Barrens on Long Island, Cape Cod, other smaller sites in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania, but this is by far the largest. Because of its latitude and glacial, some things that are at their northern limit, as well as others that are at their southern limit. It harbors an interesting assemblage of plant and animal life, including some endemic or near endemic species. And another major, well, let me talk about some of the vegetation, actually. The dominant tree species in the Pine Barrens are, guess what? Pines. It's mostly pitch pine and a lot of oak, black, scarlet, white, chestnut, post, blackjack, red maples, like it wet, black gum, swamp magnolia, and the fairly uncommon and endangered Atlantic white cedar. The understory plants, you all know these: scrub oak, vaccinium, lots of species, kalmia, 2 species, ilex, a couple species, one of my all-time favorites, clethra, leatherleaf, bayberry, lots of ground covers. When you go through the Pine Barrens, you'll see areas where there isn't much understory, but the ground is covered with lichens, mosses, some bracken ferns, small heath species, and in the wet spots, sphagnum moss. So those are the key species to help you identify where you are, I guess. The other major consideration that is important to the Pine Barrens is fire. It's often considered to be a scourge, but it's critical to preserve certain habitats. Think about the Midwestern prairies, and you see the TV shows with the bison and all, and the prairie fires. And well, that's how we got the real thick sod in the Midwestern prairies and make that so fertile. Historically, forest fires started by lightning raged across the barrens unchecked. Native Americans utilized fire to manage game. And without fire, the Pine Barrens would cease to exist because natural succession would replace the pines with deciduous trees and everything would change. So today, controlled burns are used to preserve this unique habitat. All right, so let's talk about orchids specifically. How many orchids are there? Well, if you see any other orchid talks, you get these numbers. Worldwide, most people think there are about 30,000 species. In the US and Canada, it drops way down to 250, and in New Jersey, 60. What about the Pinelands? A mere 25. And what's all this plus and minus business over here anyway? Don't we really know? And the answer is no, we don't, because it depends who you ask. And there's a lot of taxonomists that don't have enough to do, so they keep changing, rearranging, renaming, adding, deleting. It's a zoo. It's hard to keep up with. So we're going to look at, I think, almost all of these 25 species, but keep in mind, it's species, forms, varieties, and natural hybrids that we're going to talk about. So what's the distinction there? Well, here's an orchid that you've all seen, the pink lady slipper or moccasin flower. It blooms early in the year before the understory grows up enough to obscure it. It's quite an attractive plant. It's a very popular plant with any nature enthusiast. It's suicide. Don't try to dig it up. It doesn't work. You just can't do it. So enjoy it in its natural habitat. But that's the pink lady slipper. So then this must be the white lady slipper, right? No, this is the alba form, the white form of the pink lady slipper. Go figure. And what this means is These two plants have the same DNA, but with one little glitch, one little tweak that changes the color. So that's the definition of a variety, a form rather, excuse me. A form is something that has same DNA, but visible difference. That's usually color, and sometimes it's foliage. All right, so moving on, this must be the yellow form of the pink lady slipper. Nope, we're going to step up. This is actually the yellow lady slipper. And be advised, it's not a pine barrens plant, but I use it to show what we're going to talk about here in a second. This is Cypripedium parviflorum. And what do we have over here that looks something like it? Well, I can tell you that this pouch is half the size of the one on the left. It's fragrant. This plant grows in much wetter areas. It's got these beautiful uniform brown colored sepals and petals, whereas the other one can be all over the place. And the lateral petals are nicely uniformly twisted. It sure looks to me like something different, but it's not. Same DNA profile, but with a couple tweaks that change it. And we call this a variety. So a variety is something that has multiple morphological differences, and sometimes it involves a separate geographic population. So, by the way, who gets to decide when there are enough differences to warrant something being a separate species? Well, not I. I'm not smart enough. But I am smart enough to stay out of that discussion because it often ends up in serious conflict among scientists. So go figure. All right, this next one's a bit easier. Here we have 3 species of Platanthera, a genus that's one of the largest in North America, about 40 species. They're called as a group the fringed orchids. In fact, only 8 of those 40 are fringed, but who cares? So we have on the left the yellow fringed orchid. I know, I didn't name it. In the middle, the white fringed orchid, and then on the right, the gold crested orchid. Now, if when 2 of these plants, we know these are morphologically similar, so they have the same pollination strategy. The nectary and the insect reaches down and gets pollinia stuck to his eye. So they are compatible from that standpoint. If and when 2 of these are geographically proximate, meaning that they're within the range of a pollinator, and if their bloom time overlaps, they can hybridize. So the white fringed orchid hybridizes with the yellow fringed orchid, and that produces something called the bicolored orchid. The white fringed also can hybridize with the gold crested orchid, and that results in something called Candy's orchid. And these are all in the pinelands. Okay, so what are we going to talk about with native orchid habitat? Where do we find these things? And you'll maybe be frustrated. I'm not going to tell you a specific location for a specific orchid. We don't do that unless we get together in a group and we go out and be careful and protect the habitat, and avoid compaction and all that sort of thing. We're a little sensitive about divulging orchid locations because we still have people that poach them. But I want to talk to you about where they grow, what kinds of places, and you can go look for them on your own or with members of your group. And here we are in the Pine Barrens. This is Wharton State Forest, Interstate number 1. That's the road into the Wharton State Forest. So this is a pine oak forest. Sometimes it's called oak pine forest, depending on which species is got the greater numbers. And it's very acid, obviously, from all the pine needles and the oak leaves. So that has a big influence on what grows there. One of the things we find there is that pink lady slipper. And here we have, this is supposed to be a cedar bog, Atlantic white cedar. And that's a species that's really kind of threatened. It's on the wane. Um, Often these grow along the river courses, and they're usually quite wet, and they harbor additional orchid species. We have savannas. This is my favorite. Um, we have on the left side one of the rivers, and then we have the Atlantic white cedar bog or woods, and then this open area. And it's seasonally wet. Usually it's got a little bit of water. I've seen it where it's had 3 feet of water. So it's quite susceptible to fluctuations in the amount of rainfall that we have. Here's everybody's favorite orchid habitat, a sphagnum bog. And this is, in the background, these little yellow flowers are Utricularia cornuta, the horned bladderwort. You can't go out there and photograph them. This is a floating sphagnum mat, maybe 2 to 3 feet, maybe 4 feet deep, but it bobs up and down. If you put weight on it, too much weight, you'll sink right through, and that could be problematic. It could actually be fatal, actually. But that's one of the interesting features of the New Jersey pinelands, is several bogs like this. Here we still have some open water with a couple of valleys. In the foreground, we have another insectivore. These sort of rust-colored structures are the leaves of the purple pitcher plant. And they're nestled in this mat of American cranberry, this lighter green all across the bottom of the picture here. But why are bogs so special for this conversation? Well, because they're home to orchids. Most of these are grass pink, Calopogon tuberosus. But over here, below the white water lilies, we have 2 lighter pink flowers, and those are a different orchid, Rose Pagonia. So that's 2 of several species of orchids that grow in these sphagnum bogs. Wet ditches. Go figure. Well, this is a place you can find orchids. This particular wet ditch is along a paved road, fairly active paved road in the Pine Barrens. You can actually pull your car up along the shoulder of the road and take this picture without getting out of the car. It's about 10 feet from the shoulder to the woodland behind here at the upper part of the picture. And it's 3 telephone poles wide, so about 150 feet. And one year we counted 600 of these beautiful white fringed orchids in bloom. Just absolutely spectacular. I've never seen anything like it before or since. So, wet ditches. Now, let's talk about the orchids that we're going to find in the Pine Barrens. These are the genera represented, and most of them, there's only one example. But the Platanthera, which we mentioned a bit ago, the fringed orchids, there are several, and the same thing with Spiranthes, and we'll talk about those. But we're going to go through this. I think I got some of these in alphabetical order, which is for no special reason, but that was convenient at the time. So here we go, a plectrum. This is called putty root. And this is really kind of unique. This thing blooms in the spring, and it comes up looking more like a mushroom than a flowering plant. It's a bare stem, no color to it, just kind of blah. It grows up a bit, gets buds, and opens up these very attractive flowers. Seed sets and gets dispersed, and the whole thing collapses and disappears. Falls down to the forest floor and kind of just, you don't even see it anymore. Well, how does this thing survive if it didn't photosynthesize? Where are the leaves? Well, pretty clever plant, because in the fall, when the leaf canopy drops and the sunshine reaches the forest floor, a single leaf comes up, and the thing enjoys the winter sun for several months and photosynthesizes all winter, creating energy and food storage for the cycle to repeat itself again next spring. Fascinating strategy. All right, this really looks like an orchid. This is Arethusa, or dragon's mouth. This, unfortunately, is being severely impacted by climate change. I don't think I could even find this in Pennsylvania anymore. There's still a few in the Pinelands, but it's retreating northward. It used to grow down into the mountains, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It may still exist at Dolly Sods in West Virginia, but I don't know for sure. But it's on the wane. I know 2 spots in the Pinelands, and one of them is not reliable. Looks like we got a spider and fly drama going on over here. And as I remember, the fly got away. Here we have the calopogon. We saw that in the bog photo. This plant sometimes gets an albiform. It's probably one of the most common of our orchids. It covers most of the East Coast, from Newfoundland to Manitoba and south to pretty much almost to Florida. There's the white form. You're lucky to find one of those. I found it twice in the Pine Barrens in all my years there. Here's a weird looking thing. This is a coral root. The genus is Odontorhiza, and it's named coral root because the root systems kind of have a fibrous look like the coral things you pick up on the beach. But this plant is an exception to the rule. We all know, and you folks all know, that cross-pollination is better than self-pollination. It produces stronger progeny. And orchids have gone to great lengths, and they're designed, adapted, evolved, whatever you want to call it, to preclude self-pollination. But a couple of them, this one included, are an exception to that. This plant comes up again, like we talked a minute ago. It looks like mushrooms. If you kind of cover the top where the flowers are and just look at the stems, it looks like mushrooms. There's nothing to it. But the flowers open up from the bottom up, and as soon as they start to open, they immediately pollinate themselves. So you can see on the right, the lower flowers is pretty good size ovary, swelling with seed, and as you work your way up, they're smaller and smaller, and that'll continue up until they're all pollinated or until the winter kills the whole plant. And this is about all you get in terms of a flower. It doesn't open up any much more than that. And if you think about it, why bother? You don't have to be fancy or flamboyant and get a pretty flower to attract a pollinator, so the heck with it. You just do it yourself. Cypripedium acaulis, the pink lady slipper. Just a spectacular plant. Well, this plant, this picture, I think, was taken in Pennsylvania, actually. I don't think I've seen that many together in the Pine Barrens, but you get groups of them, and they can stand, maybe 18 inches tall. The color varies. I guess that's depending on soil chemistry, but it's a real stunner when you see it in bloom. There's a close-up, and you can see how pubescent it is. The whole plant, the leaves, the stem, and all the sepals and petals, very fuzzy. Well, what's this? Bunch of pretty leaves. Why is that here? This is an orchid talk. Well, this is actually an orchid. It's Goodyear pubescens, the downy rattlesnake plantain. Those of you who are old enough, the craze in the 60s and 70s, where florists would take a big brandy snifter, put some humus in the bottom, cover it with some autumn leaves like you see here, plant a little moss, a fern, maybe a wintergreen, and one of these things. And it looked great until everything died. It's just not a good idea to dig up wild orchids. And this one is extremely attractive for its foliage. The flowers are not great, but they're tiny. They're about the size of puffed rice. Remember that cereal you had as a kid? As soon as you put the milk on it, it dissolves. These flowers are about that size, and they're pubescent, but a quarter of an inch across or so, and they have the same 6 parts that we talked about early on. Isochia verticillata, the large world begonia. This is a gorgeous flower, a really neat plant. It's one of my personal favorites because of an encounter I had with a woman when I used to live in Virginia, who very kindly showed me where to find it. I returned the favor when I got transferred up to Pleasantville, New Jersey by my employer. I had her up for a visit and I drove her into the Pinelands, and I was able to show her Arethusa, one of the very few orchids she had never seen. And she was just tickled pink like the flower. Okay, this is lily leaf twayblade, Liparus liliifolia. Very unusual. I find it very attractive. Some people say it's kind of blah, but look over here on the left. You can actually see the segments through the translucent lip. Here we can see the lateral petals. They're tiny. Isn't that fascinating? And it's really, it's subtle, but it's quite attractive. This is another twayblade. This is it's the same genus, but this one it likes alkaline conditions. It grows in pond edges where it's often submerged in a few inches of water. You can also find it in mountain roads where they blasted to make the road bed, and they cracked all the rock along the edge of the road, and you've got these little springs that run water for months out of the year. It needs to be wet, but it needs alkaline conditions. So what's it doing in the pine barrens? We mentioned several times the pine barrens are very acidic. Well, think about the history of the pine barrens. A lot of industry, kind of simple as it was at the time, but there were things in it. There's a place where there's a foundation for an old pottery factory. There's Martha's Furnace. There were buildings, and they had concrete foundations. Well, what happens to concrete over time and rain and so on? The lime leaches out of the concrete, and the surrounding area ends up being a little bit alkaline, a pH of 7 or more. And so there's a couple places where this plant can be found. It probably doesn't really belong there. It was kind of a result of man-made activity. So you can call it native if you want, but it's native around the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic region. So I count it. Here's a really interesting phenomenon. This is Neodia bifolia. And if we talk about varieties and forms before, this is a perfect opportunity to have the green form, the red form, and the beige form of this plant. We don't. Nobody's done that yet. These plants are all the same. All the same. I can hardly believe it. And it's not a habitat thing, or anything in the soil. They're all growing within inches of each other. And this is special because it's the first orchid of the spring. It blooms in Virginia on April 5th and works its way north. We find it in Delaware on the 10th, in New Jersey on the 15th, and in Pennsylvania on the 20th. And it's tiny. It's really, really tiny. We'll see that in a minute. It forms nice clumps sometimes. And here on the right, you can see how it got its generic name, bifolia, 2 opposite leaves clasping the stem about 2 inches above the ground. But it is really, really little. It's about an inch top to bottom, and up here where the petals are, about 1/4 of an inch across. And where the lateral petals droop down, it's a little bit wider where it flares out. But a tiny, tiny plant. And here's that same picture we saw earlier with the mosquito. And actually, I was corrected. I showed this slide at Stockton University, and a woman said, I think that's a small crane fly of some sort. So I stand corrected, but the fact is it's really, really tiny. And what's it doing on our really, really tiny orchid? Well, you see the pollinia. We talked about that before. And we talked about mimicry. This flower mimics a female mosquito. Now, does that mean it looks like a female mosquito? Not really. And the mosquitoes can't see anyway. But the mimicry is in the form of a pheromone that this flower emits. And the pheromone pretty much duplicates chemically the pheromone emitted by female mosquitoes. So, yep, you guessed it. This horny male mosquito, and it is a male, is attracted to this flower, and in his state of euphoria, all he gets is nose full of pollinia, and he goes on to the next flower, and hopefully pollination occurs. So I apologize for that, but you can't have an orchid talk without discussing sex occasionally. So there you have it. We got that out of the way. This is another Platanthera. It's called the small woodland orchid or the club spur orchid, a couple different common names. It's fairly common, but typically in the pine barrens, it's about 3 to 4 inches tall, and it has 4 to 6 or maybe 8 flowers. This is a monster plant. I found this a number of years ago in the pine barrens. It was about 12 to 14 inches tall with 40 or 50 flowers. Just remarkable. Not a normal occurrence. So I think what this is saying, this is a polyploid. Polyploids are plants that have extra genes, extra sets of genes. And beyond that, I don't really understand that. But this is a giant. The tropical orchid growers talk about polyploids, foreign plants that are bigger, stronger, and more robust. So here we have it in the wild. I could take you to this plant where it was, not just which forest or which dirt road, but I could take you to within inches of where I found this. The problem is I've been back every year to look at it again. It's so spectacular, and I haven't seen it. It's possible it got poached. It would be really attractive to an unscrupulous collector, or the deer got it. And it's pretty much right on a deer trail. So hopefully the plant is still there and I just haven't seen it. But very small, 1/4 of an inch wide, petal tip to petal tip. And, some people think it's kind of blah. I think that's gorgeous. Green's my favorite color. And this is so subtle and just remarkably attractive in my mind. Okay, another Platanthera. This is the ragged fringed orchid, Platanthera lacera. And you can see where it gets its Latin specific name, lacerated petals. I find that this thing is affected by sunlight. When it grows in shady spots, and it does in wet spots in a deciduous woods, the plants are only about 6 to 8 inches tall. The flowers are white and very loosely arranged, maybe 6 or 8 on a stem. This one was in full sun. It's much taller. The flowers are denser. They have a yellowish cast. Totally different looking plant, but all had to do with the amount of light. This you can find, I'll tell you where this one is because people are there all the time. It's along the entrance road to Batstow Village. The problem is when it's in bloom, the grass is about waist high and it's full of chiggers. So got to think about that before you walk in there. All right, I want to show you these 3 that we talked about when we talked about natural hybrids, and I want to show you close-ups because I just think they're so amazing. Here we are again with the yellow fringed orchid. It's just the most exotic, most flamboyant, most spectacular of all our native orchids. If you come across some of these in a group, maybe half a dozen or so, an array of sunlight, it just lights up like a neon sign. It's magnificent. And the same with the white fringed orchid. Quite spectacular, especially if you happen to find 600 of them in a wet ditch. And the gold-crested orchid is much smaller, but quite dramatically colored as well. And this one, in the pine barrens, the flowers are very small, about half the size of this flower cluster. And the further south you go, the bigger the plants get. So I think this picture was taken in Maryland, but it gives you a nice close-up of the flowers. All right, this is a real specialty, and I almost hesitate to talk about it too much. This is the yellow fringeless orchid, highly endangered. I found it when I first moved to Pleasantville. I was in the Pine Barrens looking for it deliberately, and I finally got a place where it was told it was growing, and it was fenced in, and I was able to talk my way in and see these plants, but that site is now a sand quarry. So there is only one place I know in the New Jersey pine. In fact, there's only one place I know in New Jersey where this grows, and you don't see it again until you get to North Carolina. Extremely endangered. It's quite small. That penny is not brought forward. That's in the same plane as the flower. So it would take a dozen flowers to cover the penny. But it's very special. We try to protect it. The state is not particularly interested. The place where it grows is getting a little overgrown with shrubbery. It should be thinned out a little bit. We've got people working on that with the Pinelands Commission, but nothing has happened yet. I took this picture a couple of years ago. This is my cover photo on Orchids magazine a couple of years back. So, Platanthera integra, yellow fringeless orchid. It's just gorgeous. You can't say much more than that. Okay, we saw this in the bog early on. This is rose Pagonia ophioglossoides. This happens to be in a wet ditch, grows in bogs. And you see here the seed pods from last year. There's one down in the bottom here. You also see the leaves of the purple pitcher plant. This one really looks like an orchid. And it's fairly common. It grows north up into Canada, and it grows south into the southern states. All right, Spiranthes. This is a real pain in the neck. This is the most controversial genus. There are people, taxonomists and scientists, who say there are 40 species in North America. I jokingly say there are 4, but I'll bet I'm closer. They're small for the most part. A lot of them look very similar. There's a lot of natural hybridizing going on, but I'm going to show you here the 6 that I'm comfortable counting as Spiranthes in the pine barrens. Pardon me. On the left, slender ladies' tresses. In the middle, little ladies' tresses. And that plant in the middle is only 4 inches tall, and the flower is less than a 1/4 inch wide. So you have to lay down or kneel down, get a magnifier or a macro lens, but look at what happens when you enlarge that. That lip is translucent and it looks like frost on a window pane. It's absolutely spectacular. On the right, we have lace lip ladies' tresses. This one is one of the tall ones. This gets to be waist high and it grows in standing water. And moving on with the Spiranthes, on the left, downy rattlesnake or downy Spiranthes. It's the most common. It sometimes pops up in backyards. It's thought to be the forebearer of many of the other plants that people are trying to give new names to. In the middle is Vernalis, so this is the spring bloomer. And on the right is another variety of slender ladies' tresses. The first one we saw on the left on the previous slide and this one are basically the same species, but the one we had before had a green lip. This one does not. And finally, Tipularia, the cranefly orchid. This is like the first one we had, the eplectrum that doesn't have a leaf. This comes up looking like mushrooms, and it flowers, it sets seed, and it's back, and then in the fall, it gets a leaf that photosynthesizes over the winter. So real quick, why is NAOC interested? NAOC is a branch of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is a branch of the Smithsonian Institution. And here we have Peter Zale from Longwood Gardens, and over his shoulder, one of his associates and a technician. He's in a bog. What's he doing? He is collecting a little sample of the root. He pulled back the sphagnum, gets a little snippet of root, which goes to the Smithsonian for DNA analysis. You can see here, this was a young plant. It didn't flower this year, but here you see next year's bud. This will be next year's plant. And then the following year, there's another one formed already. So we're studying the DNA to help identify what plant is what and what's related to whom and why does that matter. For protection, federal protection purposes, Does a hybrid get protection or not? So we're trying to sort that out. Here we have a different bog. This one is not in New Jersey, but I just want to show you what can happen if a group of people put their heads together. This bog is in a power line right of way, and during COVID, they stopped clearing it for some reason, just I guess scheduling problems. So we got together as a group, the Native Orchid Conference, and a whole bunch of other organizations, including native plant societies from all around the area, the Brandywine Conservancy, a bunch of land trusts, folks from Delaware College. And on a Saturday, just about almost 2 years ago to the day, on a Saturday, we were in there with 100 volunteers, including 40 Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And we cleared out all the brushy vegetation to expose the orchids and clear out the orchid. This is also part of the Smithsonian's work. Here we have a motion camera trained on these white-fringed orchids. And if you're studying the pollination and the DNA, you got to study the pollinators. So these cameras are set up to take pictures of the insects. And it's 3 hours away from the Smithsonian and 2 hours away from me. So we enlisted the Girl Scouts. And they have to come in every couple of days and download the data and make sure the camera didn't fall over and change the batteries. And that's a good thing that we have kids, because, you know, who are you going to call? You need a techie, not me, teenagers. So there is some of the things that they're getting when they have the cameras out. So it's fascinating stuff. And for me, you probably have figured out by now, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a hacker, but I'm learning a lot, and I'm anxious to help out. Here's another project that the Smithsonian is working on. This has the same ditch with 600 white-fringed orchids. Here's one of them down in the lower right. This lady is from the University of Copenhagen. She's a professor and a scientist, and she's here several summers in a row now working on this project with NAOC. And the guy in the green is from the Mount Cuba Center. And I brought them to this place to study these flowers. And what they have done there is they collected pollen from these flowers. We drove down the road about 5 miles where we found some of these little gold-crested orchids. And we took the pollen and we pollinated the gold-crested orchid. And then we got pollen from them. We went back up the road and cross-pollinated the white-fringed orchids. And they marked those flowers with a little thread. They put a tag on the ground, they got the GPS coordinates, and marked the individual flowers, went back in the fall, collected the seed. And the seed went to Longwood Gardens, where it was germinated, and in record time brought the flower. And so all of this work ultimately is going to lead to better knowledge and better capability of germinating native orchid seeds in the lab and making the seedlings available to botanic gardens for public display, and for reintroducing seedlings to degraded habitat for conservation purposes. And ultimately, maybe we'll be able to grow some of these at home. So there's the Canby eye. And there's Dr. Melissa McCormick from NAOC, who's doing all the DNA work. Those of you who are Orchid Society members, if you go back to Orchids Magazine this July, there's an article in there about her work, and her work involves that bog I mentioned with the Scout project in Pennsylvania, but the second site is the New Jersey Pine Barrens. So it's a critical link in the chain of places she's studying. She went from Hazleton, Pennsylvania to the Pine Barrens to Maryland, and then down to the Barrens on the Gulf Coast, sampling all these orange and white fringed orchids and trying to sort them out. You can help folks like that. You can volunteer at Longwood, at Mount Cuba. You can help Melissa collect samples. And the other thing you can do is just keep your eyes and ears open. Here we are again. Guess where we are? That same wet ditch with 600 white fringed orchids. And this is a friend of mine who's telling this guy, out of here. Don't come back until after the fall when the seeds have spread. Don't mow this ditch until later on. So I encourage you to get out, tramp through the woods, find the native orchids, study them, get involved with people through native plant societies, hardy plant societies, the Native Orchid Conference, and increase your knowledge and hopefully help a little bit in preserving some of these things. And with that, I guess we can take some questions.
Cool, Bob. That was outstanding. I love the history of the Pine Barrens and the information about orchids in general. And it's really amazing photographs. Did you take all those yourself?
I did, except the ones with the pollinia on the butterflies. Those are a friend.
Really cool. Really cool. Let's see here. So we have a few questions and
Okay.
a few things I thought of myself. Near the end there, you mentioned Hazleton, PA.
Yes.
Somebody had asked, are the Plectanthera the same as the ones in Hazleton?
Yes. You mean the ones in the Pine Barrens, I assume?
Yeah,
Yes. Plectanthera ciliaris is the bright orange one. Blephara glottis is the white one. So yes, it's those two, and their hybrid is the bicolored orchid. And there are a few bicoloreds in, I believe it's just north of Cape May County. I guess Atlantic County. Somebody's got him in his backyard, and I have a question about that. I've not been there. I haven't met the gentleman, but I'd like to know if that's natural or if he created the bog. It's fascinating.
Well, that leads into a good question. A number of people mentioned that they have some growing on their property. Somebody mentioned specifically that once you put up a deer fence, some of the orchids showed up. Are these primarily bog plants, and is it something you can create a bog in your yard and grow some of these?
That's the $1 million question. That always comes up. And for decades, I've been cautioning people against even trying it. You got to be really determined, have lots of time, and maybe be a little masochistic. I don't know. However, that's changing. I don't recommend, certainly don't dig up native orchids.
Yeah.
And you really can't get the seeds going unless you have laboratory conditions. There are people that do it. There's somebody out there saying, "Oh, Bob, you're nuts." Yeah, I know. There's exceptions to everything, but by and large, it's very tricky. Conditions have to be sterile for the seeds and the seedlings. So my position is let's rely on the longwoods of the world. And it's not just longwood. It's very accomplished scientists of many disciplines in prestigious organizations around the world that are working on this. And when I first started doing this 20 years ago, it was like, don't even think about it. But I'm saying now, we're gonna see it. Peter Zale, if you go to Longwood, they have a little, I guess call it a YouTube thing, where he explains how he germinated these seeds and what he's going to do with it, which is what I mentioned before. So we're going to get there. So the other part of your question, are these all bog plants? No, many of them are forest plants. The lady slippers, the rattlesnake plantain, the isotria, but several of them are bog plants. So in the South, from the Carolinas south, around the Gulf Coast, some people have actually created a bog garden. It's physical work. You got to dig a hole deep enough. I don't know the dimensions, but you can create a bog garden, and they've been very successful. Some of these fellows, but it's the likes of Jim Fowler and people like that really know what they're doing. Of course, Jim passed a couple of years ago, but he had a terrific bog garden. A couple people grow these in, like we talked about, the terrariums. A couple of folks in our society have some calipogan growing in a terrarium. A big glass bowl of brandy snifter. I have mixed feelings. I don't try it. I go out. The exercise does you good. Go out and look at them in the wild. But keep your eye on Peter Zale and NAOC, the North American Orchid Conservation Center, which has its own website, and Orchids Magazine, and the Native Orchid Conference Journal, where we have kids that we support financially that are doing research on this whole subject. So
Yeah, I put
we're
some
getting there.
in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, I saw a presentation a few years back from somebody from the Smithsonian, from Cirque, and they were talking how like so many of these orchids, they have a very tight relationship with mycorrhiza.
Yep,
That's why you can't just dig them up and put them in
exactly.
hard.
Exactly.
Got to have the right conditions, and plus, so many are endangered.
Yeah.
You don't want to be encouraging people to go out and dig them up. I think one of the things I wanted to point out too, like most orchids are epiphytes that grow up in trees and things like that, whereas these are terrestrials that are actually growing in the ground in the soil.
Yep, absolutely.
Which is different than the most things you would.
The epiphytes are in the tropics and subtropics for the most part. There's only one epiphyte that grows in the United States north of Florida. Um, Everything else is south.
It's cool. I was wondering, you mentioned the pollination. Who does most of the pollination on these? Is it bees or flies?
It's an assortment. The Platantheras, it's mostly butterflies and moths. Diurnal, day-flying moths, because they have a long proboscis that goes down into that spur on the back of the flower. So I would say mostly it's that. Bees are another important, particularly the smaller flowers. Sweat bees, euglossine bees. I don't know all the taxonomy of the bees, but there's a lot of small.
Yeah,
Some of them are really glossy, pretty little colored bees that pollinate as well. And guess what? The horny mosquito.
yeah, and yeah, so many of these orchids you show, they have these very tiny flowers, sprays of them very tiny. So big bumblebees
Yep.
are going to be doing the job there. Cool. Somebody asked, like, do most of these bloom in the spring, or do they bloom different times of the year?
That's a real good question, and it's being impacted by climate change. A couple of things are blooming a little bit earlier than they used to, but there's a succession. And I mentioned we start on April 15th with that Neodia bifolia. And shortly thereafter, I mean, a matter of days or a week, you get the pink lady slipper and a few others that go through. The calopogon and grass pink and arethusa are late spring. The platantheras are generally later, anywhere from mid-July to mid-August. The one coral root, the autumn coral root, that's like October, that one that self-pollinates. So is a succession. So that that's frustrating. You go out to look at orchids and you think, oh, I'm going to see all these orchids that grow in the pine barrens. Well, you're only going to see a few. And you got to go back next week and see a few more, and next week and see a few more. But the exercise does you good.
Yeah. Well, that leads into another question, because somebody asked, like, your phalaenopsis that you buy in the supermarket, they'll bloom for a month, 2 months.
Yep.
I assume these are more ephemeral. That they
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see. The lady slipper is probably 2 to 3 weeks. Some of them that have multiple flowers on a stem last a little longer. The platantheras, they bloom from the bottom up. And so you can get, the first to open on a given day and the last to open maybe 4 weeks later, but the bottom ones will all be dried up. So you'll try to time it so you get the most in bloom at the same time and get a nice picture right in the middle of their bloom time.
Yeah, I was wondering too. So people asked, so I guess deer like to eat these?
Most of them.
Most of them.
Most of the plants and most of the deer.
Yeah, they're tasty. Yeah.
I should mention there are people, if you're going to try a native orchid, the only one that I would suggest, if you're really determined, is the yellow lady slipper. Now, I don't know how that would do in South Jersey. It would do well in North Jersey, and I guess we got people on here from all over the place. They grow in the mountainous areas of Pennsylvania, and I'm sure it crossed into to the northern counties of New Jersey in mixed deciduous forests. So those you can buy seedlings through some of the catalogs where you get your, your bulbs, your peonies, your perennials, and all that. Very expensive. A deer fence is essential, but it's, you get the whole thing. It's just like growing tropical orchids. You have to know the habitat. So go out in the woods and see where these things are growing. What's the extent of the tree canopy? I mean, is it totally dense, or is there a little bit of light or filtered light? Check the soil. How much humus is there? How wet is it? Check the conditions and try to duplicate them. And if you have a spot in your yard, maybe you're fortunate enough to have a house that was built with a forest in the background and some of it's still there. You might be able to do it. You might be able to do it.
Let's see here. I think we pretty much covered it. Someone was asking about dragon's mouth orchid. How far north does it go?
Oh, that goes way north. That blooms in Newfoundland and all across the southern part of Canada to Manitoba, and even a little bit further north than that. But it's on the wane here. Like I say, I don't know if I could find it in Pennsylvania. Dolly Sides is a remote possibility. There's one spot in New Jersey that's reliable in the Pine Barrens, but other than that, you got to go north.
Yeah, and that'll probably, climate change will push it further.
Yep.
Pretty cool. I think that's pretty much it.
Great.
And thank you again so much. This was a wonderful presentation. It was so informative, and yeah, so I hope people have more appreciation of the variety of things that are growing here in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And the importance of protecting the Pine Barrens and Pinelands Preserve.
Critical habitat. Very unique.
Yeah. Okay.
And thank you for the invite, and thanks for everybody who tuned in. I can be found easily online if you have any specific questions that come up. I'd be glad to chat with anybody. So I think when this thing gets posted for folks, I think I included a list of the flora at the end. I'm not sure if that's there or not.
We can include that on our website. No problem. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Take care.